residential solar PV and storage in New Zealand, and had a deep dive into solar generation and demand data across 4 key regions. For those of you who are interested, this research will soon be made available on our website, so watch this space. Today's installment will shift the focus to the consumer's perspective of residential solar. To give some context, this research came from a desire for EECA to better understand the current residential solar space in New Zealand, particularly around identifying opportunities for information, advice, and support to help consumers. As an authority, we see it as our purpose to provide clear, accurate, and impartial information to enable New Zealanders to become clean and clever energy users. Today, we're going to explore a few things. We're going to explore the experiences of New Zealanders who have investigated, considered, and installed solar. We'll unpack the customer journey, including motivators, barriers, key milestones, and opportunities to influence. And we'll discuss opportunities to support and drive greater adoption of solar and the role that EECA and the wider energy sector can play in this. Without spoiling anything too much, the findings from this research will confirm that there is a need to support solar consumers throughout the entire journey. And that's from early awareness and initial investigation, right through to post-installation and aftercare. Before I introduce our research partner, I have just a small bit of housekeeping. So if we have time, we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So feel free to please add any questions to the Q&A function in the bottom there, and we'll do our best to get to them then. Now a little bit about our research partner. So EECA partnered with the research agency, or TRA, to conduct this research. TRA are a leading research agency in New Zealand with a strong track record of partnering with EECA over the past few years to deliver qualitative and quantitative research projects. I'd now like to introduce Margot, who has led this research from TRA's side. Margot is a cross-disciplinary researcher practicing in both qualitative and quantitative methodologies. In her work, she's been helping organizations use human sciences to understand how to better connect with, design for, and serve people. She specializes in social change research and has worked extensively for federal, state, and local governments and for not-for-profit organizations in Australia and New Zealand. Margot currently leads a multidisciplinary team of researchers at TRA, where she oversees the delivery of consumer, business, and brand market research and insights for EECA. With that, I'll hand it over to you, Margot, to take it away.
Amazing. Thanks, Mitch. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, I must say, and a joy to partner with EECA on this research. My colleague Shasha, who is also on the call, and I do a lot of work in the consumer understanding and mapping, customer journeys space. And I tell you, this one was certainly one of the most involved that we've heard people go through. So as Mitch said, today is all about the consumer perspective, their experiences investigating, financing and installing solar. So what we're going to see today is that the language and ideas relayed in this sort of document and presentation really do mirror the words used by people that we spoke to and how they describe their experience. Now, to gather all of the insights that we're going to share with you today, we spoke to 24 people who have recently been all the way or partway through the experience of investigating and installing solar at their home. And we had really rich, robust, deep, qualitative discussions with each of them to unpack what was going on. Those who have not seriously considered residential solar were not the focus of this research, and that's just really important framing for me to sort of make clear at the start, because when we refer to consumers in this particular research, it's not everyone. It is those who have actively been through the process. So please just keep that in mind as we go through. Now, importantly, there are 3 groups within our audience, and they really reflect kind of different stages of the journey. So we have investigators. These are people who have, as advertised, investigated solar in the last 12 months, but decided not to proceed with it in the next 2 years. We have a second group who we're calling them intenders. So they are actively planning on having solar installed in the next 12 months. So they, have their finances sort of sorted and ready to go, but they haven't actually, had it installed on their property yet. And then our purchasers who have been all the way through the journey. They've had solar installed in the last 20 months, some of them quite fresh, and some of them have, been living with it for a while in their home. Okay, so what are we going to cover? It's a pretty punchy session, folks, so I'm going to give you a tour of the highlights. As mentioned, it's a really meaty journey, so there's a lot more that sits behind what we're going to go through today. Please go nuts on the chat function, ask questions, and we can get to them to help unpack any specific areas of interest that you have. What we're going to do is we're going to start by going through some of the sort of contextual and consumer mindset insights that came from the research. And this is really important to help kind of ground and put a bit of a framework around how people actually navigate the journey and experience in themselves. Then we get into the good stuff. This is where we actually will unpack each stage of the customer journey. We'll go through step by step. I'll give you a bit of an overview of kind of what's going on at each of those stages, the main needs and tensions that are cropping up along the way, and then we'll kind of like dive into some of the key areas for each of those stages too. And then we're going to bring it all together in a nice bow and answer some questions. So that's where we're headed, and let's get into it. Okay, context and consumer mindset. The 5 things that you kind of really need to know here. The first is that for our consumers, solar is seen as a really valuable but significant investment. And this puts a lot of pressure on themselves. They want to get it right. They use words like investment, asset to describe this particular type of purchase. It also means that they're seeing an opportunity, both from sort of like a day-to-day financial perspective, but also as well a longer term sort of like value add piece that comes with this kind of mindset of investment and asset. Because it's such a sort of like a high stakes decision for people, what this means as we go through the process is that for many, it's a really considered and quite drawn out journey that they go on. Now, although solar has been around for a while, from the consumer perspective, it's actually still seen as quite new, evolving technology. And this can be quite overwhelming for many consumers to understand and sort of keep up with the most relevant information. They're really relying on those in the know, and we see a lot of sort of deferring to suppliers to help get them up to date and tell them what's the latest. Many of our consumers as well anticipate that there's always going to be more to learn in this space as it evolves, and that a constant stream of better products is going to become available, as the months and years move on. It's interesting because this can actually create some inertia. It's sort of like, when do I jump? Is now too soon? Am I going to miss out on something better if I bite the bullet now? The path to purchase is mostly linear. Now, this is quite an interesting one for us. Sometimes we see customer journeys like sort of diverge and go all over the shop, but actually it's pretty consistent for all of our consumers. Now, that's not to say that there aren't nuances. Some of them take a lot longer than others, but it's pretty much, A to B to B to C to C to D and so forth. Whilst it is quite linear, though, we see that it is absolutely punctuated with a lot of pauses. There are a lot of emotional ups and downs, and there are some real sort of deep moments of engagement that occur as well. Now, a lot of this journey is actually quite rational for people, but we do want to call out here that there are emotions that underpin how consumers respond and behave for each stage of the journey. Now, once consumers are on the journey, they're really, really trying to make solar happen for them. This is quite different to some of the other journeys that we see, where the first stages are actually about convincing them that it's a good thing. Your consumers, when they're on this pathway, they're already there. You've already won the hearts, if you will. They already believe in the value of the technology. So the journey is really about turning that focus to whether solar is right for them now. Can I actually make it sort of a realistic, feasible thing in my world? So because they're trying to, I guess, like make it happen, where they do come up against sort of stumbling blocks or pauses or hurdles, it doesn't mean that they've necessarily thrown in the towel. It might mean that they just have to come back later, but it's not necessarily all is lost. And the final thing before we get into the stages themselves is that research is a constant feature throughout the journey, not confined to just sort of one stage. The depth of what they're sort of researching does depend on sort of an individual's consumer's level of interest in the topic, but everyone is doing research in some shape or form. The majority as well do return to research again, and it can either be gathering new information, it can be revisiting earlier findings. So that kind of comes back to the idea that tech and information is constantly evolving, and also as well top-ups for what they already know. So everyone moves through the process, but not everyone's starting in the same place. Okay, let's get into the stages. We have a 9-stage customer journey for residential solar, but they actually kind of occur in blocks, if you will. The first is really a pre-awareness stage. This is even before the journey starts, sort of officially, if you will. And here people are passively or actively encountering solar just in their everyday life. So this might be through media, conversations, industry trends, and these sort of shape up early perceptions people have. We then get into the journey itself, and this starts with an initial interest sparked, then moves through to research, learning, and evaluating if they can actually sort of make it happen. This is where a lot of our investigators sit. The next block here is all about execution. They're locking in the supplier, they're locking in finance, they're making the payments, and they're getting it installed. This is where our intenders are. Our purchasers have been through this process, but this is where, I guess, like the rubber hits the road. And finally, the last stage is all about living life with solar. And these insights here are really from our purchasers, some who have had it, installed for a month and others who have had it installed for, some time longer than that. Okay, let's get into it, working through each stage. Pre-awareness. So when consumers are just sort of like out in the world, passively or actively hearing or seeing solar, they're this is shaping up the kind of initial impressions that they're going to have about the technology and what it could mean for them. So whilst it's not sort of like technically, I guess, like part of the journey, the reason we've called it out is because it can actually have a massive influence on how people experience the first part of the actual journey itself. It forms that baseline for what they know and indeed what facts actually might need to be sort of corrected later down the track. So diving in a little bit, we see that, most New Zealanders have had some touch point with solar, mostly passive, and solar is often not really like sort of top of mind for people in this particular phase. But we do know that the impressions form long before they're actively considering it. Some of the people that we spoke to actually describe themselves as kind of quite, I guess like nerdy on the topic, and needless to say, they're actually, understanding and diving into more of the facts around it. They talk about, I'm following news stories about Solar City, etc. So these people are in a bit of a different space. But overall, unless you've kind of been sort of under a rock, everyone's kind of heard about solar or seen a panel somewhere out there in the world. Now, common impressions consumers mentioned to us that they had at this sort of very early stage, sort of centered around these 4 key themes. 1, solar doesn't work in cloudy weather. 2, you need batteries for solar to work. 3, payback periods. Many actually thought they were a lot longer than they actually are. And when they got into the journey itself, there's some perception really changed for them. And then the last one is that solar is evolving so fast, it's actually better to wait. So some of the consumers that we spoke to in the journey still held some of these beliefs, particularly around batteries. This sort of clarification really doesn't come up for people until much later down the track. But a lot of these do get cleared up as people start to do quite active research about what solar could mean for them. Okay, so now the journey officially starts. Something sparks their interest in a solar system for their home. The key features of this stage is that there's a really clear shift in mindset. I want this for myself. But the spark doesn't necessarily mean that they act on it immediately. And we found that when they are ready to embark on the next step, the entry point for what that is can be really unclear for people. They're saying, like, where do I start? What do I investigate? And they wade in, I'd say, like quite gingerly. But what is it that sparks this interest? Well, they kind of fall into two buckets here. Usually it's what we're calling a hard prompt. So these are sort of like really immediate external pressures that sort of force a consideration. This might be something like a power bill hike, So either due to sort of, rises in energy prices or actually an increase in their sort of personal energy usage, planning to build a new house or home renovations, or a change in their financial capacity. That one only featured for a few, but examples we were given there is, I received an inheritance, I actually found out about the green loan, or, some other sort of financial, came into some other sort of financial means. There are also soft prompts at play, and how these influences that are actually quite gradual, and sort of start seeding ideas, but are less forceful than our hard prompts. So these include things like visiting friends and family or neighbours who have had solar installed, hearing about solar on a radio show, so a solar expert speaks on Radio NZ as an example, or seeing solar at a home show. So these can all start to sort of seed that idea that it's for them and get them interested. Once that sort of spark has happened, our consumers go about a process of really just sort of gathering information. They want to learn about solar systems and what it means to get one and how. And this is all, I guess, in the service of the question, is this the right time for me to get solar? And can I make it happen? So they loop around here, and gathering and learning is always with this question in mind. So that's a really, really important part. The key insights from this stage are that the process of researching, gathering information is really crucial for bringing consumers to the right baseline of knowledge. We saw in that pre-awareness phase, there are a lot of misconceptions, sort of outdated perceptions, and people are just like not that engaged at that point. So here is where we get the opportunity to say, hey, this is where we're at today. These things are no longer relevant, and this is what you need to know. I think what is sort of like quite tricky about this particular phase, though, is that because there are so many parts to the research and so many topics, which we'll kind of go into shortly, it can be really overwhelming. The information that people are often seeking at this point as well is quite generalized, and if not careful, they can actually lead people even further astray or set the wrong expectations. How we see this play out is particularly around sort of the cost of what solar is going to be for them and system requirements. Interestingly, when we spoke to people, most think that there's actually a lot of information out there. So they're not saying that there's an information deficit, but they're not always sure what they can trust. So who are the credible voices and what is up to date? So what's that current information? So diving into a bit more detail about how and what they are researching. The how. We see that effort on research can range from a really quick scan to like a real in-depth journey. And there's sort of like three personas, if you will, or distinct groups here. The first is a real extensive research type, and they're researching because they love it. This tends to be that group that I spoke about before, that have a more general interest in solar. They might have sort of interest in sort of sustainable, renewable energy, and they're a bit more in touch with the technical side of things. So research is actually part of the fun for this group. Where most of our consumers sit, though, is extensive research for reassurance. They're starting from a real blank space. So they invest the time, energy, and sort of resource into learning because they think that that's going to reduce the risk for them. The goal here is really confidence, but this can be overwhelming, and a lot of them don't know how much is enough. When should I stop? And then we have a sort of a smaller group here where bare minimum. What they're looking to do is really just enough information to make me, I guess, sort of feel like I've done my due diligence, if you will. And they're often sort of deferring. They're not doing their own research as such, and they're more likely to turn to, say, suppliers or experts to just answer the key questions for them. A really key feature about this group is that they are typically financially ready to go. And when I say that they have the financial capacity to sort of pay up front. So they've kind of already decided, and it's just ticking a few boxes to make sure I'm not totally in the dark. What are they researching? Oh, sorry, where are they researching? Well, most start with a very extensive online search. This kind of comes back to the point of they don't really know where to go first. So Google is the first port of call, and they're kind of just typing in some words, solar for my home. Literally can be as generic as that. What they are looking at here, and you can see like sort of the different places that they're going in their Google deep dive. This is often supplemented with sort of like social media to get I put in quotes here, the real perspective from other people who have been through the process. And then sort of trusted individuals as well. So tradespeople, local electricians, who have had experience actually going through the process and installing it for other people. With these particular sources, though, what's quite important to note is that the type of information they're looking for is really mixed bag. So it is articles, it is videos, it is photos, it is testimonials. They don't kind of neatly fit into a box, if that makes sense. In terms of the sort of long or short form content as well, there is absolutely a need for both, but people don't quite know what they want from each sort of content form at this stage. What's quite important here is that people are using a lot of these sort of sources, and the reason that they're doing that is to try and corroborate their facts. They're aware that, they're not sure who to trust, what's up to date. So if I can sort of triangulate a lot of sources, that might help create a clearer picture for me. Independent sort of sources, neutral third parties, government, for example, these are really critical for helping to kind of cut through conflicting messages and simplify the technical sort of complexity. So when they're trying to look to triangulate, these sort of sources do carry a lot of weight there. So now on to what they are researching. As you can see, the topics are really broad. They range from how a solar system works, range of products, who supplies it, and really trying to start to demystify the financial side of things. Financial side of things here is not just financing, but what savings are actually up for grabs? What does this idea of sort of payback period mean? Do I make money off it? And how much do I have to outlay? So there's a lot going on. But four kind of key areas, I guess we could group this topics of research into: the financing, cost, benefits, and savings, how the solar system works, products and components, and suppliers and installers. And this just gives you a little bit of a sense of, within each of those buckets, what it is that they're looking up at this particular stage. Now, given the amount of words on this page, I think it's unsurprising to say that the risk of information overload at this stage and paralysis is high, and this can really halt the process. We see a lot of people pause, put it down for, I don't know, somewhere between 1 to 3 to 6 months before coming back to it again, because it feels like a lot. So how do we kind of get past that, I guess, since it is sort of a point where some people, get stuck in the weeds? Progressing to the next stage really comes when consumers can answer yes to the question, is solar right for me now? So it kind of comes down to a sense of financial readiness, home suitability, and confidence in the technology. So like I brought you back to at the start, this section is all about, in service of the question, is solar right for me now? Now, not all is lost. If the answer is no, it doesn't actually mean that everyone abandons solar. We see this in other journeys. You get like a sharp, drop off and never to be returned again. We do see some of our investigators pause, but from our purchasers and even our intenders, we see that they may eventually return when the timing is right, but this could be 2, 5, 10 years down the track. With just a quick sort of closer look at our investigators, because they are the ones that at the moment are sort of not proceeding all the way through the journey and having more wobble moments, if you will. It's really here and in the next evaluation stage where they're likely to drop out at the journey. And the main reasons that they sort of do this through this research process is because all of the information that they've gathered to date tells them that they cannot afford it or they cannot obtain financing for it. They find out through this process that their property is not suitable for or optimal even for a solar system, or it would require some enhancements or renovations to get it up to speed. They're not confident that they'll be in their property long term to reap the benefits. This is actually one of the sort of really, really big ones. And goes back to that point about, solar being an investment, an asset, an extension of my home. And another one, I guess, is probably not to be ignored is that sometimes other financial priorities are just more important at that particular time. And a really sort of clarifying insight for both Shasha and I through this is that investigators don't actually experience sort of what we call unique barriers or barriers that are sort of really wholesale different to our other consumers through this process. It's more that these reasons that we've just gone through here at that time outweigh the benefits for them to proceed with the decision. Okay, lots of information gathered, mind's just blowing. Let's sort of, I guess, put it into a more structured form. We get to an evaluation phase, and what happens here is that all the information is used to assess whether they can make it happen. And sometimes they need to do, I guess, top-ups to really do that sort of like evidence-based structured decision making. The key insights at this particular stage is that it's really quite a lot more methodical and structured. The way our consumers described it to us is evidence-based decision making as their mindset. I know they're the words that they came up with themselves. And so the importance of information that is very precise and specific to their situation can be very make or break here. In that previous situation where they were gathering information, and we said that sometimes it can be a bit generalized, that really falls down when we get to this point here and people are needing to make those very sort of active trade-offs, particularly financial ones. What we do see is that financing is a big part of this, that clarity around it, and adoption is much easier when financing is clear for people. Even further, when financial options show them that they don't actually need to make lifestyle sacrifices, that is an even greater sort of, motivator to proceed. This stage here can be a mix of, really reassuring and affirming for people, but also super disheartening. It's where people get the serious reality check. And it can be quite confronting because expectations that they've sort of gathered and formulated along the way can often be quite misaligned with sort of the reality of making it happen for them. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the assessment criteria, if you will, that people go through. And 4 areas, again, what do you know? Financing, technical considerations, practical fit, and suppliers and installers. So when they go through the assessment, financing, the types of things that they're kind of focusing on is really getting a clear understanding of payback periods, return on investment. They're evaluating things like PPA versus green loans versus incentives. They're checking for hidden costs. They're really wanting to generate a realistic picture of what this is going to mean for me in terms of a financial outlay. There are technical considerations that they're thinking about as well. What are the maintenance requirements and the product lifespan? The size of the system and compatibility with my home. Battery storage versus not. These are they get a bit more, I guess, research savvy at this point, and they are looking for a level up in technical understanding for themselves and also what they're hearing from those that they're talking to. There's an assessment piece around practical fit. And I think that really sort of makes sense. Like, is my roof suitable for solar panels, or do I have a place in my yard, say? Do I need electrical upgrades? Can I actually sort of facilitate having this extra sort of energy sort of user in my home? And then suppliers, installers. Here they're starting to get to the nitty-gritty of sort of quotes and courting the different suppliers that are out there in the market. They're really checking on reputation of the different companies that they're investigating. What do they offer in terms of warranties, post-installation support, customer reviews, and word of mouth recommendations. We're going to focus on two of these aspects that are really pronounced and shape the experience for people, so either good or bad. The first is suppliers and getting quotes, and then financing. So if we get into suppliers, consumers, they're typically getting quotes from two to three. But when they go through that process, it doesn't necessarily all being sort of genuinely considered at that stage. What we're seeing when it comes to sort of supplier investigation and sort of consultation, there's an element of wanting to do your due diligence there. It's a sizable investment, as they tell us, so two to three quotes for most people feels like a sound way to go about it. At a minimum, they're looking at a local supplier as well as a larger, what they call well-known company. We really didn't speak to many people who sort of went above and beyond two to three quotes. It feels quite cumbersome for them after that point, but this is that sort of happy due diligence medium, if you will. On the whole, we found that local suppliers are generally in higher favour than the sort of larger, well-known companies. While some certainly sort of preferred kind of those with a national footprint for that sort of scale and perceptions of being long-standing and reliable, there was a real soft spot for those who were, as they call it, just down the road. Often they could get a better gauge on that sort of reputation, word of mouth. If something goes wrong, I know where to find them, and surely they're going to do a good job if they've got that sort of reputation within my local community, or my sort of town or city. Now, a long-standing supplier is very compelling here. They're looking for suppliers that have got runs on the board. And this was an interesting one for us because we were curious about whether or not people felt that there were enough suppliers in the market, and whether they had sort of that choice in suppliers as well. Most said actually yes, because they are looking for those who have had, 10, 15, 20 years, and have had the experience of evolving with the tech. So they would be in the best place to know, learn from experience, and what's right for now. A lot of new players sort of were not very appealing for people when their idea was floated. The types of oh, where are we? Sorry, team. Here we go. Now, the types of companies people mentioned were quite a few, and these are the list of suppliers that people told us they got quotes from. So you can see that there is a mix here of those kind of larger national and local suppliers here. Not fully exhaustive, but I think it does highlight, it's not concentrated or monopolized into just a few. Okay, so moving on to sort of the financing side of things, because this is a real, thorn in people's side. So financing, how to go about it is a massive tension. It's stressful. A lot of the kind of go ahead or not really hinges on what's available to them. And it's not always clear what the full range of options are. But it's so important because I cannot even tell you, people just felt the sort of feasibility, the attainability of solar was opened up to them when that financing piece became clear. So how are people approaching financing, and what are their sort of preferences? We saw a few who did prefer that kind of outright purchase if they had the sort of financial means to go ahead. This idea of, I want to own it. I don't want any debt. My mortgage is always already big enough. Like, let's just not pile on. So some definitely sat in that camp. But as mentioned, it's those who kind of have come into an inheritance or have that financial capacity to make that outlay sort of now. They're not necessarily having to save for it. They've got those means. Many choose to take a loan, a green loan, or another 0 to 1% loan. It makes financial sense to them. It sort of really reduces sort of the barriers to enter there. And it sort of, I guess, like puts out for them to say, okay, well, 5 to 7 years time, this is something I could pay off like comfortably, and it's not going to create too much other strain in areas of my life. So some did consider taking out sort of like another loan or extending a loan. So whether that be like, onto a mortgage or something like that. And whilst this was considered, it wasn't often seen as desirable. Those kind of higher interest rates really sort of deterred them from that being a viable option. Um, Others explored kind of structured financing situations. That's very appealing to people, knowing how much they outlay they've kind of got if they could pay for it installments. Um, Very few fully understand PPA. Actually, most of them confuse it with a traditional loan. They use those terminologies sort of interchangeably. So absolutely kind of a knowledge gap there. Of those who did know about PPA, Solar Zero immediately comes to mind. And to be honest with you, in the market at the moment, those two things are relatively synonymous. So a lot to do here in terms of clarifying what PPA is all about for people. Banks and suppliers are also sort of key sources for financing advice, but the information can be quite inconsistent from these sources. Now, something to note is this sort of financial clarity is happening in stage 4. It's such a fundamental part of the process, but it's like really happening quite late down the track. When we spoke to people to kind of do a bit of a retrospective, this is the type of information that they really would like sooner in the journey. Now, most people have heard of green loans, but it's not accessible to all. It was a real game changer for people, I tell you. And so some had already used this option on other energy efficient products in their home, so they knew about it through that. At the time, actually, or at this time, sorry, rather, green loans are actually not coming up for people as part of their solar journey specifically. They're kind of coming up in sort of parallel or tangential threads of their life, at which point they're like, oh my gosh, I could use that for solar. So an example here is they might be talking to their bank about something or see advertising from their bank about a green loan. Like I said, it hasn't come through their research journey for solar. It's come up in another way, but they've connected the dots and seen how they could make this work for them. There is absolutely appetite for consumers to know more about green loans in that earlier stage and would help to allay some of those initial sort of financing tensions that they have. Um, for people without a mortgage, especially retirees, they talk about how sort of desirable this loan is, but they acknowledge and they've been through a process where they're not always eligible to get it. And this is a quite a sticking point for this group and actually has meant that a few of them have dropped out of the journey completely because it's just not going to be, they cannot finance solar for themselves. Okay, and the final sort of point to say about sort of financing here, it's a slightly different dimension to it, but still really influential for people when they're faced with the kind of actual and realistic cost of what it is what are they going to have to give up to invest in this? So whether it's purchasing solar outright or taking on loan repayments, many are thinking about what else could they be spending their money on. So unlike, say, major expenses like holiday or home renovations, where people are more willing to cut back and save for it, and what we heard from our consumers here is that solar doesn't feel as kind of urgent enough to justify the lifestyle sacrifices that this could translate to yet. So what we observed among some of our investigators and the experience of some of our intenders and purchasers is that this sort of trade-off piece can lead them to pause in their journey here. The final thing, sorry, is that absolutely that 0 to 1% loan can overcome this particular barrier that people come up against. Okay, now we get into the execution phase. So that was all research, evaluation, like can we make it happen? And this is let's get it done. The key points to note about this stage are that suppliers play a massive role. They really, really do influence the confidence of our consumers. And it's a supplier, I guess you could say, like conduct, knowledge, sort of, the customer experience that they give people that really sets one apart from another in the eyes of the consumers, particularly as well because a lot of our consumers felt that quotes were relatively comparable. So what else is there to distinguish who it is we might proceed with? At this stage, being I guess, like the first of the executional runs, it's a monumental step. It marks a milestone. Consumers feel like they're actually taking that, a foot forward towards solar for their home. Now, suppliers, yes, they play that kind of critical role, but what are the kind of like pros and cons that people are asking themselves when they're, sort of pitting one against another? They're asking themselves, like, do I trust them? Is there the reputation there? Are there past experiences or word of mouth runs on the board? Are they clear and upfront? So transparent quotes that are tailored to me. I'm not having to sort of dig or ask to get more information from them. Do they know what they're talking about? What they're looking for suppliers is actually to be technical. Sure, like make sure people can understand it, but get into the nuts and bolts. A few of our, I guess, more involved consumers said, there were times where they felt like they had more knowledge about the topic than the actual rep, and that is not a good sign. Are they supportive and support my own learning of the journey? Again, it's a big investment. I'm quite wedded to getting this done. So help me understand as well and take me on that journey. What happens if something goes wrong? They're wanting to know what warranties and aftercare reassurances are in place and on offer. And then also as well, do they do some of the legwork for me? So do they arrange approvals and consents on my behalf so that I don't have to worry about all of that paperwork? The experiences with suppliers in that kind of courting phase, we'll call it, really did vary for people. But positively, every purchaser did find at least one that they were satisfied with. So as mentioned, 2 to 3 quotes, not always a good experience, but always one that was sort of satisfactory. What we saw here is this really comes down to sort of the responsiveness. How long does it take for them to get back to me? Are they, again, like supportive of my learning? Do they fill me with confidence, with enough kind of information? Do they, dare I say it, sort of patronize me, or make me feel, sort of little about my understanding? All of these things really sort of like contribute to how our consumers are perceiving their suppliers and ultimately which one gets the deal. So a successful supplier here really helps de-risk the final decision for people. And there's a lot of pressure that consumers place on themselves to pick the right supplier. So they're saying yes when there's clear and tailored quotes, strong communication and responsiveness, aftercare assurances, a seamless process, and taking care of council approvals and consents. I must say the last one's a little bit of like a cherry on top, but nonetheless a feature for those who were very, I guess, happy with the supplier they chose. Okay, the next point here is around financial commitment and purchase. So this is financing gets locked in, they're making the payment, and this is all triggering the ordering of products. The key points to note about this stage is that it can be hard for some to secure financing or quite a lengthy process with loan applications. This is not the case for all, but certainly we heard it for, I guess, drag out for some people. Another key aspect of this stage that's worth drawing your attention to is that those ready to purchase spend some time in this stage getting comfortable with the cost. It's quite interesting because obviously here, they've got the figure blanket on a page. They know what it's going to be. But this final price is actually often misaligned with some of their very early expectations. The reason being for this is at the start, they're sort of hearing or talking about it in ballparks. Oh, it's probably like 10, I don't know, 10 panels, 10 grand seems to be this figure that everyone's got locked into their mind and they're anchoring on it hard. So as soon as they see 50, well, even 30 to 50 grand, that is a stark contrast. Now, that comes about because, someone's actually come out to their house. They've seen they need more panels. Maybe they need a battery as well. But this misalignment here means that it's quite a, chewy piece of meat for people to swallow over time. Now, as they wait for their products to arrive, one thing we notice here is that there's a real lack of clarity for people about what comes next. Our consumers from this point onwards are feeling a little bit in the dark, and they feel that there's not clear information about what to expect from the next phase install and, living my life with solar phases. They're asking questions like, oh, is this normal? Am I supposed to be waiting this long? What happens here? And some of them who don't have that kind of wraparound support from their suppliers feel like they're left in a bit of a vacuum. So this commitment, this financial commitment, it brings excitement, but also last minute nerves. The decision is so real when they part with their money. Um, what they are doing here is, paying up front. Even those who do have the capacity are sometimes opting for a loan to retain that kind of liquidity. They're adding it to their mortgage if they want. They're getting their banks and suppliers to manage a lot of the loan approval process if they can. And then they're just sort of waiting and waiting and waiting. It just, I think, as kind of like that final point on that end cost often does exceed that sort of initial expectations here. This is where and the reason I want to stress this is because what we heard from our consumers is they're a little bit misguided as to what getting a quote means. And I think this is important for this group. Some of them think that they're getting a quote when they're sort of filling out an online form. It doesn't lead to a house inspection, or maybe they're using their own sort of calculator to do a proxy estimate, if you will. So that is what some of our consumers call getting a quote, but we know that that's not actually what we think about, from a supplier or industry perspective. It's a lot more tailored and involved than that. So these two, I guess, sort of definitions or perspectives really lead to a lot of confusion and hold up for people. So just want to highlight that there for you. Okay, we're getting close to the home stretch, team, so well done. We get into our installation and setup phase. So this is the actual physical installation of their solar system. And our key points to note at this stage is that logistic or technical hiccups can, frustrate. Sometimes there are delays, but they're not, they're not overwhelming for people. It's just, you're so close to clinching the deal, and every little sort of push out sort of does add. Now, for this particular stage and afters, many of our consumers describe not knowing what good looks like, not knowing what normal looks like, and it's really uncharted territory for people. Most of the people we spoke to didn't actually know that many other people with solar, so they didn't have what we call sort of reference points for them to go by. What this means is that they're really seeking extra reassurance from the installer that the setup was actually successful. And we see that poor communication from installers does create sort of nervousness and confusion. This is really important when there are teams that sort of come in and install and then just poof, disappear. And there's not actually that sort of verbalization of, you're good to go now, it's all working. Simple as that, I know. So for most, the experience is actually really fast. It's quite seamless. Many said, "Oh, actually, it only took one to 2 to 3 days." I was quite surprised by that. They thought it would be again a drawn out process given the journey that they've been on so far. They do note that sometimes installers, come back to check on things like the meter board, they might have to do something with the connection, but it is pretty swift and seamless. Where there is some shortcomings, if you will, is when things feel kind of like, I guess, rushed. There isn't that sort of communication. Sometimes it feels like there's not really a good handoff between the person who sold them the solar and then the person who comes to, or the team that actually comes to install it themselves, or where there's sort of like multiple tradespeople kind of traipsing through their house and they don't really understand the role that they're playing and how they kind of fit together. This was an experience for only a minority minority of the people that we spoke to, but that's where the experience can vary and not feel as smooth. So a great installation experience, if we're to look at, the kind of North Star, if you will, is one where wraparound care is a huge feature. So their sort of supplier is professional and efficient. There is that pre and post installation communication, and they kind of stand out for really personalized sort of service. This is really helpful when there is that either continuity from the sale and the house inspection through to the installation, but even a good handover works well there. And also as well, they get almost like a 101 on how to use their system in situ at the time that it's installed. Okay, the last section. So this is, I'm living my life with solar. I have the system installed. What's going on here? This is a tricky one. I tell you, the key points here is that the first 12 months are a real steep learning curve for people. Emotional highs and emotional lows. System performance and export rate, their expectations are often you're really sort of misaligned. Things are like falling short there. But what we see is that on the other side of that, so typically once you've been through a full sort of season, if you will, is that things get a lot better after that. Those who have kind of come through a full season journey, they look back and reflect on those first 12 months and say, actually, I don't think I was adequately informed, and I really didn't understand that sort of translation of all that knowledge I thought I had into the reality and the practice of what it would mean for solar to look like in my home. In this particular stage as well, we see a lot of sort of just individual, behavior change. People are doing things different to get the most out of their systems. And we also see a phase of reappraising their electricity provider, their system, and considering upgrades. So the first few weeks are full of excitement, and they're adjusting to solar. They're doing things like tracking performance becomes a daily habit. They love their app. They cannot get enough of their app. They're treating it like a game, and they are showing everybody who will take an interest and even those who will not. There is some initial uncertainty, though, about their system function. So, they're asking questions like, and this is often like corroborated with their app, like, oh, is it operating at full capacity? Why does the production actually vary day by day in different weather conditions? Oh, it's winter. Does that, what was I saying 3 months ago? So whilst they'd actually researched all this stuff earlier, it's like when they put it into practice that some of these realizations actually emerge. Those with that good sort of supplier relationship, this is a much more sort of streamlined and clearer process for them. There are surprises for people, particularly when it comes to billing. They get sort of unexpected energy bills. Part of that's because there's sometimes like a misalignment between their sort of installation and the billing cycle. They're expecting to see those changes right away, those savings, if you will, right away. And also what's revealed to us here is that actually for a lot of our consumers, there's a fundamental misunderstanding about how exporting energy works. And the last thing we see is that people are really sort of shifting their routines to maximize their solar benefits. So if they think that their system's not performing enough, they don't think they're getting enough savings, they're really trying to make their system work harder for them. So that's things like, when they use their appliances, it looks like, maybe considering a battery. It looks like or a range of things. Okay, so at this particular stage, all of this kind of new learning in practice, and I really sort of stress that, leads to a question around reevaluating their electricity provider. Should they stay or should they go? Some consumers stay, others seek better deals. And this is often like sort of crops up when they go, oh, I didn't realize actually there was a cap on how much I could export. So again, like putting it back down into reality and what it looks like in sort of practice. If they're not satisfied, they will sort of shop around, and they're making trade-offs between things like, free power, evening hours of free power versus the different sort of buyback rates that I can get. So some people are absolutely disappointed to find that their exported solar energy earns them far less than they thought. But this is part of the thing about they need the kind of full year to see it play out in practice. And the electricity plan confusion really does lead to a bit of sort of inertia and sort of a dampener on how they're feeling about this really exciting purchase they've just made. So the role of ongoing support and aftercare is really sort of like quite critical here, and totally alleviates and takes away all of those frustrations that I sort of just outlined on the page before. So what people are looking for is, follow-ups that happen regularly at a good cadence, 1, 3, 6, 12 months, because their learnings over each of those phases is really cumulative, and they're wanting someone to help them and clarify the picture for them at each of those kind of key milestones. Um, Also, as well, aftercare and ongoing support to really help them understand what those kind of maintenance expectations are going to be, and that sort of ongoing sort of care for their system. And then as well, that kind of, how accessible is that information for people? Sometimes a house call or, a phone call doesn't go astray. They're not wanting to, I guess, like go through this aftercare process on their own accord. They're wanting to be chaperoned through. And as mentioned, there is that sort of extra point of reassessment. So some people at this stage, once they've been through the year, they're reconsidering batteries. They're thinking about their electricity provider, but aside from this, they're really happy with it. Okay, rounding out team power. The last bit is that reflection and advocacy. This is, I guess, really good news and a happy ending to the story. The two key things to note here is that solar adopters, they really look back and say, I wish I had done it sooner. I can't wait to tell everyone else about it and encourage them to do it as well. Those challenges that they had through the journey, they really do fade over time, and they kind of pale in comparison to the long-term benefits that they see themselves getting once they're actually, on the other side of those 12 months living with solar. Very few have sort of regrets. Sure, they wish they've done some things differently, but they're really comfortable and happy with where they're at. And this is partly because those sort of benefits, or they hope solar would be for them, are being realized, and they're starting to see how it's paying back for them. And their message to other people is really clear. It's just do it. Just do it. This is what they would tell everybody. That word of mouth is really powerful, something you can absolutely leverage for snowballing, and seeing is believing. Having a friend or neighbor with solar serves as a confidence booster, and really sells itself. So bringing it all together, we see, that we have a mammoth customer journey for how people move through their residential solar experience. And these include the key moments for people, the needs at each stage, the barriers they face and tension points, the information that they're seeking and from where, and the emotional journey that they're going through that really underpins their headspace at each stage. If there are a few things that you take away from today, if nothing else, it's that solar is a highly desirable investment. People don't need to be convinced about the value of the tech. It's all about how. How can I make it happen? Key barriers really kind of center around personal context and timing, but those kind of touch points can also accelerate decisions as well. The journey's long, but it's very, very active. And a long journey doesn't mean you've lost a customer. And our intenders are absolutely low-hanging fruit. They just need that extra support and confidence boost, particularly around that financing and supplier phase. Four key opportunity areas to elevate the experience for people. So these really stem from the kind of pronounced barriers. Information tensions to address throughout the journey. Make financing clearer. Show people what to expect and what's normal during installation and in year one with solar. And also supplier consistency and aftercare and ongoing support. How can we support the sector to to really deliver in this, what is quite a, like we said, uncharted territory for people on this journey at the moment. And that rounds us out. Thank you so much for going on the journey. I know there was a lot there, and I only did the highlights as well. Um, I will stop sharing my screen. Do we have any sort of immediate questions, Mitch? But otherwise, so happy to answer and feedback kind of
Yeah.
via verbal format or written.
So fortunately, because we are over our time limit, Sasha's been an absolute gun and answered most of the questions in the chat as we've been going. There's a couple of outstanding ones, so we'll just approach you directly just with some responses to those, just for the sake of time today. But yeah, obviously a huge thank you to TRA, Margot, Sasha, for all your awesome work on this project, and a huge thank you for all of you for joining us today. I hope you found this discussion to be insightful. I found the findings to be very exciting. This certainly highlights that there's a lot of space for EECA to play in to further support consumers in the solar space. And these findings will be used by EECA to help us further shape our informational offering moving forward, as well as providing insight into where would be best for us to maybe partner with other organisations to support the solar journey for New Zealand households. We're in the final stages of finalising this report, and it will be published on our website along with the report discussed in our previous seminar. And we'll also send out links to the recordings for both this session and the previous session. In the meantime, though, if you have any further thoughts or questions to share, please don't hesitate to reach out. We'd really appreciate any further insight or thoughts that you may have. But in the meantime, so thank you so much for joining us today, and ngā mihi nui. Thank you. Cheers, guys.
Kia kite.